Now, one of the great lessons I've learned, and I've been doing this work for about 30 years now. I started out in New York City, doing outreach on the streets there, and then in the shelters in Boston, and then in the woods in western Massachusetts. And the lesson that I learned is that the people I met were doing much more than simply surviving. Now, as Earl pointed out, survival is one of the top things you got to do. I mean, that's on your mind. It's a second job, as he said, or a first job, really. But beyond survival, the people I met were creating these worlds full of meaning. And it was very, very interesting to come across these folks, and I've learned a lot from them. Now, what I mean by that what comes into their view of things is their sense of culture, their aspirations, their fears, their strengths. And it might even reflect things like mental health issues or needing a drug or the challenges of day-to-day survival and homelessness. Now, as Michael Rowe, a well-known researcher and author, stated, outreach encounters take place at a boundary. And it's a boundary that divides one world from another. On one side of that boundary, we got the person who's experiencing homelessness. And like I said, his sense of meaning, the fears, the aspirations, the goals, all of that. And the outreach worker is trying to connect with that person, to build a relationship, to develop a sense of trust, to respect the person's autonomy, and to jump off of their meaning if we're actually going to truly help them and gain their trust. On the other side of that boundary is the world of resources and services. And resources and services, with all of the providers that are doing it, are defined in certain ways. Like if you go to Social Security to get a benefit, they focus a lot on disability. And they have that a lot in their languaging. You know, are you disabled? If you go to a mental health clinic to get help and counseling, they may focus on diagnosis and mental illness and medication and psychotherapy. These are not necessarily all friendly words to the people on the other side of that boundary. See where I'm going with this? So the question is, as an outreach worker, how do we help connect the person to the services that are available? And what I like to say as outreach workers, we're basically interpreters on the one hand, because we know the houses of language of the providers and the different places and what they expect, the eligibility criteria, but we also understand the language of the person we're trying to help and where they're at, their words, their ideas, their values, and it's all about how we make the match. So we're interpreters and we're bridge builders, and that's really the cornerstone of outreach. Now, one of the things we know is that homelessness and trauma are interconnected. Just to become homeless, you go through a certain amount of trauma, a great deal of that. To survive as being homeless, you go through more trauma. And many people, prior to homelessness, had gone through trauma in their families or whatever they've been through in life. Now, Viktor Frankl states, and he's a man that wrote the book Search for Meaning, and he survived being in a concentration camp in World War II, so he knows a thing or two about trauma. And he talks about the idea that finding meaning, finding a sense of purpose, can be a way to deal with trauma. And that in a sense, we're all meaning makers. And he says that despair is suffering without meaning. Think about that statement. It's a very heavy statement. So when you meet someone who's homeless, they're doing a lot not to despair. Some are despairing. But many are creating these worlds that I talked about. So I want to take you back to the 1980s when I first started in the work. I was the age of many of you in the audience. I was a student coming out from Columbia University, and I met my first field advisor, I like to call him, hands-on guy. His name was Old Man Ray, and he lived at the Port Authority. I'm just going to read a little excerpt. During my first days of outreach, I was immediately puzzled by the deceptively simple task of helping an elderly homeless man who lived at New York City's Port Authority. He was a short, stocky white male of 67 years with a long white beard. His mobility was somewhat hampered, but he could move slowly about by using a cane to get around to the shops throughout the building. He spent most of his time sitting on a milk crate and observing the multitude of people making their way to work and other activities while quietly having a quick meal. You can count on him to be there on a daily basis along with a variety of shops, newsstands, and commuters. He called himself Old Man Ray, and he had become a fixture of Port Authority. First time I approached Old Man Ray, he surprised me with his outward sense of satisfaction and connection to his environment. In fact, while I was still transitioning to my role as an outreach worker, Ray had long been adapted to his life at the Port Authority. During his first meeting, he said to me, "I am the night watchman, and if you want to know what goes on around here, all you got to do is ask." He then went on to ask how he could be of service to me. You see, in my mind, he had immediately reversed the tables. My offer to help him did not resonate in his world, and I left our meeting feeling a little stuck, yet excited about the challenges of outreach and what appeared to be the enigmatic world of homeless individuals. I was left with an important and at times the central question of outreach. How do you help folks who are clearly in need, yet communicate no need for help? And so there I was. I was a new graduate, had my MSW. I remember it like it was yesterday. I approached Old Man Ray. I had my list of resources. I was clinically trained. And he wanted to help me. And that's when I had my first real learning. Because what it's really about is listening and connecting. And it was important, if you think about it, Ray was this older fellow. I was the young guy who was kind of wet behind the ears, right? So what made sense kind of in our world, if you think about it, as an elder, that for him to play the role of a wise elder and to tell me about things and tell me about the Port Authority. He was the expert on his world. That's the key. I wasn't the expert on his world. I needed to learn about his world. Well, that's the key of homeless outreach. The other thing that's very interesting is think about how Old Man Ray dealt with being homeless and that traumatic experience. How he became the night watchman. How he found a sense of meaning. The question is, how do we jump off that meaning? Not take it away from people. Jump off of it to help them. Very, very important when it comes to the art of outreach. So, the central question, how do we help folks who refuse our help? What I like to talk about is we do a pre-treatment model, and that is all about beginning where the person is at. The definition of pre-treatment is it's an approach that enhances safety while promoting transition to housing and or treatment alternatives through person-centered supportive interventions that develop goals and motivation to create positive change. Listen, folks, it's really all about developing individualized pathways to recovery. Really get started where people are at. There's 5 basic principles that guide us when we do outreach, what I call a pre-treatment approach. I'm going to name them really fast. The first is relationship building, developing that trust, as I talked about, good communication. The second is common language development, really tuning into a person's words, ideas, and values. And when we make goals with a person, it needs to be in their words and reflect their ideas and values, not be in our clinical language. Thirdly, supporting transitions, how we go about doing that, to whether it's to a new program or to housing or to new people. If you think about it, transitions are happening everywhere, but the way we support transitions are crucial. Fourth, it's understanding change and the change process and the stages of change. And the way we do that and work with people is critical. We use something called the change model and motivational interviewing techniques. Fifth, it's promoting safety, which is always on our mind. Is the person safe right now in front of us? We do harm reduction approaches, which, by the way, Housing First, which you'll hear a little bit about today, is a harm reduction approach because we get people immediately housed. Not saying that they have to wait and do services and do treatment first. Build the services around them, and then from there, work on the road toward a recovery or potentially treatment by using a pre-treatment model to help develop that role I want to add. And then the other piece is we work out of crisis. And with crisis, we can often offer people things right away that they need, including treatment. Someone's in a medical crisis. Old Man Ray, when I was working with him, the way I was able to help him is one day someone stole his cane. I had the relationship with him. He went into a crisis over that cane being missing. He wasn't very mobile. His feet were swollen. He had bruises and infections that he was dealing with that he hadn't shared with me prior. But at that point, he was ready. He was ready to get some help, and I was the person he was willing to actually call over and request the help. So the last thing I want to get into is the cost of prolonged homelessness. Because what happens? We try to help these folks, we don't reach everybody. Some people actually stay on the street for long periods of time, become chronically homeless. And there have been a number of studies on this. One thing I want to say, there was a study by Dr. James O'Connell. He did a 5-year study of 119 street dwellers in Boston. And he found that this group of folks, over 5 years now, accounted for 18,384 emergency room visits, 871 hospitalizations. So there's a high financial cost to homelessness, and particularly unsheltered street homelessness. The yearly cost was $28,000 around, not exactly, over $28,000 per person per year, versus for a similar population housed, it was a little over $6,000. That's a saving of over $22,000 per year per person. Well, guess how much it costs to do housing with support services? About $15,000. So we could actually save money and help people at the same time. Secondly, in terms of people's health, there's mortality risk. Dr. James O'Connell, also with folks from Healthcare for the Homeless, developed a vulnerability index study and found very high mortality rates among the unsheltered homeless folks. Alarming how high these mortality rates are. People that fell into certain categories were at high risk. I'm going to name the categories quickly. If you're over 60 years of age, you were at high risk of death. If you had a triple diagnosis of mental illness, substance abuse, and medical issues, you were at high risk of death. If you had more than 3 hospitalizations over the past year, or 3 ER visits in the past 3 months, you were at high risk of death. If you had a history of frostbite, hypothermia, or trench foot, a history, you currently have to have that issue, you were at high risk of death. If you had a diagnosis of HIV, AIDS, liver, or renal disease, you were at high risk of death. Over a 5-year period, 40% of the people that fell into those categories died. The average age of death was 47 years old. So folks, this is a call to action. There's people out there, they need our help. It takes a village, as Earl was saying earlier. We need to come up with some action steps and plan. Now, people have responded across the country with Housing First and new initiatives to help these at-risk people due to the cost and the mortality rates. And we locally have responded. In Springfield, we developed something called the REACH program. We had 18 participants that were served in REACH. Dave Havens, who's right here at the table, was the person who was directing that program, that effort. It was an initiative partnering with outreach teams, and we had over 85% success of people maintaining their housing, people coming directly from the streets. They didn't have to be in treatment first, and we were very successful with that program. And we have a lot of great stuff going on locally in Westfield, including some housing connected with the Samaritan Inn shelter. We've got the Next Step program, which is kind of a work program, as well as a program connected with affordable housing. We have the Safe Haven program that we mentioned earlier. Andrea mentioned it during her presentation. It takes people directly off the streets. We got a lot of good stuff, and of course, Ann Lankeen, who's been doing fantastic work in developing housing. Thank you very much.